Familiar piece of history. If you think about those plagues that God brought upon Egypt in relationship to releasing, ultimately, his people from the grips of the Egyptian Pharaoh. I want to ask you a question before I get into that text, though, and just peruse with you for a minute about what I want to share with you this morning. But if I ask you quickly to answer this question, what would your response be? Is compromise good or bad? And I suppose, I would hope that maybe your answer to that would be, it depends, right? Compromise can be a good thing. There are many a time where I wish people would just find a common ground and live with it, right? And all of the hatred and the fighting and the angriness and all the things that often accompany when people disagree, you wish that people could find some way to just figure out some compromise in the process. When we're talking about trivial matters, I suppose all of us ought to be willing to be a little more compromising and not so demanding of what we want or what we would like, but give way to others maybe in the preferences they have. There are many occasions where compromise is preferable, where compromise is almost in some senses necessary, and I would argue that it's a good thing, but friends, it's not always a good thing. Sometimes we compromise on the wrong things. Sometimes we make compromises where we should not be making compromises. Tanner led for us the song, Give Me the Bible, right? When it comes to the things that God has said, when it comes to that which Scripture has revealed to us, those are uncompromising. Those are things that we cannot compromise because they came from God. They're not within our grip or within our veracity or authority to be deciding whether we should do or not do what God has said, or should we make some kind of compromising connectivity. No, it is our responsibility to do that which God has said. We come to an interesting moment in Exodus chapter 8 where we come to, I believe, what is the fourth of the plagues that God sends when He's about to send these swarms of flies upon Egypt. But He's about to do something He hadn't done yet. And that is, He's going to spare the Israelites from the plague that He's sending on the land. Up until this point, everybody had been suffering alike. Everybody had been facing the same challenges and difficulties that the plagues that God was bringing was creating for those folks. And at the end of the process, here in the begin this swarm of flies, God does something very different, where He says, I want the Egyptians to understand the difference between what I'm doing against them and how I am sparing the Israelites, and I'm going to separate them. Have you ever been driving down the road and a rainstorm come up and you can't figure out why you're seeing rain pouring down in front of you, but your car is dry? And there's almost like a dividing line, and it's almost, mystical to you. It's possible that right there, square in front of you, seems to be pouring down rain, but where I am standing, it is completely dry, a dividing line. Can you imagine the oddity, if you will? Can you imagine the magnitude of the mindset of the Egyptians? That everywhere they're walking, they're doing this because the flies are everywhere, but they look over to the land of Goshen where the Israelites are, and there's not a fly to be found. God has literally separated them from the consequences of that plague in order to try to deliver and to remind and to lead Pharaoh to decide to do the right thing and let God's people go. And maybe at times with the things that Pharaoh suggests to Moses, you might think that some of his requests are reasonable. And walk with me now as we begin thinking about the furtherance of this conversation in Exodus chapter 8. When all of these challenges come, Pharaoh ultimately comes back to Moses after witnessing this situation with the flies and all the corruption that it brings. Verse 25 of Exodus 8, Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, Go sacrifice to your God. Now notice it, in the land. The first compromise Pharaoh wants Moses to make is, go ahead and sacrifice to your God, but do it here. You're not leaving. You're not going to a land that God's sending you to. You're not heading back to the homeland or the promised land. You're not returning anyway. Go ahead. I'm going to allow you to make sacrifice, but you're going to do it right here. Compromise number one. But Moses says, well, that seems reasonable. We might think that that would be the response of Moses. Well, at least he's going to allow us to sacrifice to our God. At least he's going to let us worship our God. Maybe this will be okay. No, what Moses says is the exact opposite. He says, it is not right to do so. For we would be sacrificing the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. Number one, how is that a sacrifice on our behalf towards our God if we're just taking the things that belong to you and offering them? We see a similar scene like that in the life of David, if you recall, when David was dealing with all the challenges and he wanted to make a sacrifice before God, and there at the threshing floor of Ornan, and he says, I'll have to pay for it all. I've got to buy the sacrifice we're going to offer. I want to buy the land in which we're going to build it. And he buys everything that the temple eventually is going to be built on. Because David said, I will not sacrifice to God something that costs me nothing. Moses cannot compromise this. I cannot compromise the instructions and commands of God. It is not right for me to do so. I've got to separate myself from the Egyptians to make the proper sacrifice. And secondly, he says, if we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, then will they not stone us? If we take their possessions and right in front of them, take those and make sacrifice to our God with them, then we're writing our own death sentence. They'll stone us to death. There's no compromising this, Pharaoh. Number one, it would be an abomination before God to sacrifice in such a way. Number two, you're asking us to risk our own lives because your own countrymen will stone us to death if they witness sacrificing these things before their God. We will go 3 days, verse 27. We will go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God. Notice, as He will command us. The overreaching principle of our study this morning is simply that. There is no compromise where God has commanded. There's no compromise where God has commanded. There's no let's strike a deal. There's no, well, that sounds, but isn't this just as reasonable? No, Moses recognized that when God commands, we follow. When God instructs, we follow. If we want His blessing, if we want His benefits, if we want the things that He desires from us, we cannot compromise where God has commanded. And Moses recognizes that we can't make the kind of sacrifices necessary if we don't separate from the things that would hinder that proper sacrifice. Let me show you a parallel over, and I'm going to mark Exodus chapter 8. But notice over in Romans chapter 6. And I just want you to show you a parallel principle in a couple of verses of Romans chapter 6. Paul said this, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Fair question. Can we compromise, he says, can we compromise with sin in order that maybe grace would even grow in even greater ways? Notice verse 12. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in its lust. What's the answer to that question? Certainly not, he says in verse 2. And in verse 12, he reminds, can we really let sin, can we really compromise with sinful things? Verse 14, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. You can't compromise with the thing that's keeping you away from God. You can't make compromise. You need to separate yourself from sins in order to embrace what God intends for us. It is not that we'll be perfect. It is somehow earn the grace of God. It's none of those things. We've studied that before. But I think Moses shares with us a principle here, and that is if we're going to serve God the right way, we've got to separate ourselves from anything that's hindering that process. Jesus said it this way in Matthew chapter 6. He said, seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Can I ask you a sobering question this morning? When was the last time you could notate, where you could definitively outline or note where you put God first over something else? How long would it take you? How long would it take me to be able to sit down, take a piece of paper and a pencil, and write down, here was a moment in my life where I chose God over everything else? I had lots of options. I had lots of things in front of me. I had all kinds of things that I could choose, but I chose to seek God and His kingdom first. How long would it take you? Let me make it more personal. How long would it take you to write down a note where you compromised God? I know what God wanted. I knew what God commanded. I knew what God desired. I knew what He wanted from me. But the situation in my mind was reasonable to compromise those things. And I'm simply trying to, I'm not trying to embarrass you or get you to think negatively here. I'm just trying to get you to appreciate the realities of it. If we would find it easier to write down the number of times we have compromised what God's principles are, what God has taught us, what God has commanded of us, if we could write those compromising moments down quicker than the moments where we actually elevated God to His rightful position, then we need to be asking ourselves some very serious faith questions, right? Moses recognized that he could not sacrifice to God in the right way if he doesn't separate himself in the manner in which God desired away from the Egyptians so that he could sacrifice in an appropriate way towards God. And so here comes another offer. Go back to Exodus 8. So Moses says, can't do it here in the land, got to go at least 3 days away. So Pharaoh says, verse 28, I will let you go, that ye may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness. All right. Pharaoh says, I'll compromise with you. I'll let you go, but you will not go very far. Intercede for me. So don't go very far, he says. You can leave, but you're not going 3 days. You can separate yourselves a little bit, but not very far. Do you know that's what Satan tells us all the time? No, and I'm not talking about him appearing in a red suit and a pitchfork and horns on your shoulder. But what I'm saying is when Satan throws temptations at us, he throws little things at us through people, through situations, through opportunities, through behavioral. And he's okay. He's okay with you being semi-religious, but he doesn't want you to go too deep into it, right? He wants to keep you at arm's length. If he can get you to just take half a step towards God, he really doesn't need to do much else. He's really kept you away from God entirely. Pharaoh says, go ahead and go, Moses, but don't go very far. And Satan tells you and I that all the time. You don't have to be so fanatical. Do you really have to be completely committed? Satan's trying to convince us to compromise with the fullness of what God desires from us. Go back to that text we read in Romans chapter 6 and just read a little bit more of it. I don't have two of these things in my Bible where I would have suggested you mark both of those texts. But go back to Romans chapter 6. And just note a couple of more verses. We just mentioned the one a few minutes ago, when that grace may abound, God forbid, or certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? If I've died to sin through Jesus, why would I want to compromise with sin afterwards? Why would I want to stay close to it when the grace of God has delivered me from it? Verse 17, verse of chapter 6 of Romans. But God be thanked that though you were slaves or servants of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered. And having been set free from sin, you become servants or slaves of righteousness. The writer Paul wants us to appreciate a choice that has to be made, and there's no compromising them. You choose which one you're going to serve. You can choose righteousness to life, or you can choose unrighteousness and sin to condemnation. Serve one of them because you're going to be one way or the other anyway. There's no compromising those two things. And sometimes we try to get just enough distance, but not real separation from the things that are challenging us and troubling us. Because there's always that temptation to look back. Whether it be plowing a field and looking back, whether it be lost wife, whether it be can get us to not go very far, then he can obviously get us to very quickly look back to where we've come from. And maybe choose to compromise and return back to those things. So, some more plagues come. We don't have time to deal with all of the details of that this morning. But we return back to the same issue. Pharaoh still hasn't let them go. And in chapter 10, verse 11, here comes yet one more offer of compromise. So he says, "Not so, go now, you who are men, and serve the Lord, for that is what you desired." And they were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. All right. Sacrifice right here. Moses says, can't do it that way. That's a compromise against God's commands. Okay, don't go very far. Nope, we've got to get genuine separation from you in order to be able to sacrifice unto God the right way. That's God's commands. All right, Pharaoh says, then how about just the men go? How about just, now think about that. This isn't about a guy's night out at the ball game. This is about Pharaoh saying, leave your families behind. Leave that which is most precious to you behind, because it will ultimately compel you to what? Come back. Pharaoh is trying to get Moses to compromise by leaving behind the most precious things these men have, their families, in order that once they get a little ways away, they go, you know what, I don't know that I can do this, and back to Egypt they go. And so often we entrench ourselves in things so deeply sometimes it's hard to let it go. If we leave any connectivity to those things, those parental obligations that God provides, the responsibilities that we have to our family, that they'll ultimately come to the surface, and the next thing you know, we're heading right back to Egypt. By the way, if you fast forward in the history, even after they left, they wanted to go back, and it didn't even have anything to do with their families. It had to do with things like cucumbers, right? They didn't like the food they had to eat out in the wilderness. They were ready to go back to Egypt based on their dietary issues, let alone their families. Can you imagine how quickly? I don't know that they'd even left. If they give this compromise to Pharaoh and just the men, I don't even know that they leave. That compromise was far-reaching. Those responsibilities to children, to train them up, to honor father and mother, all those things that we know the Bible teaches us about family, all those are going to compel them to return. This compromise won't work either. All right, Pharaoh says, you can go, you can leave, and you can take your families. But notice, verse 24 of Exodus chapter 10, then Pharaoh called to Moses and said, go serve the Lord, only let your flocks and your herds be kept back. Let your little ones also go with you. Okay, go ahead and take everybody. But you're not taking the livestock. Moses says, you must also give us sacrifices and burnt offerings that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. So first it was, you're not going to sacrifice. Then it was, you can't go very far. Then it was, you can't take everybody with you. Now, and because Moses keeps saying, we can't do it that way, we can't do it that way, we can't do it that way. Now Pharaoh says, okay, everybody go ahead and go, but you can't take anything with you to make the sacrifice. it's going to take a lot to get Pharaoh to relent, isn't it? And you know the whole history. One compromise after another, Moses is having to reject it. He needed those things to make the proper sacrifice. What purpose would it be for them to leave but not be able to sacrifice to God? Those blessings were intended to be used for good. And Pharaoh says, leave them behind. One compromise after another. So, finally, after a final plague comes, he finally calls for Moses in verse 31 of chapter 12. For Moses and Aaron by night, and said, rise, go out from among my people, both you and your children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone. And bless me also. I find that interesting. We don't have time to pursue that this morning. Moses stayed his ground. The people wanted him out. Pharaoh wants him out. None of Pharaoh's compromises would have honored the commands of God. Though his compromises may have appeared reasonable at times, though the compromises may have seemed even something that would be effective and beneficial for everybody, if we could just give a little. But friends, I'm trying to get us to understand this morning a very simple concept, and that is when it comes to God and His instructions and His commands and His desires and His will for us, there is no compromise. There never has been. There's no compromise. Our responsibility, if we want the benefit, if we want that which God is offering to us, if we want that which God is presenting before us, then our responsibility is to honor it, to fulfill it, to follow after it, to pursue it, and to not compromise. Verse 3 of 1 John chapter 2, he says, now by this we know that we know Him, if, notice it, if we keep His commandments. He who says, I know Him, and does not keep His commandments is a liar. That's a pretty bold statement, but I didn't say it. John did. He said, he who says, I know Him, and does not keep His commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in Him. Can I ask you a simple question this morning? Someday I will stand before the Creator of all things, including me. And I'll have to give an answer to Him. Will I go before Jesus? Will I go before my Creator someday with a lengthy list of, well, Lord, I thought this would work just as well. Well, Lord, I thought that would be okay as well. Lord, I thought a little compromise wouldn't hurt. Lord, I thought... Or will I stand before Him humbly, recognizing my own personal unworthiness, but with a life filled with commitment to serving and honoring the commands and instructions of God without trying to compromise what God wants from me? Which feels like a better approach towards eternity. And Moses illustrated for us the unwavering commitment to the commands and instructions of God, and I think it serves as a great illustration for us of how we must serve uncompromisingly. Just do what God has asked of us, no more or less. No man would have a right to demand of you anything further than God has commanded, and nor we should expect anything less of ourselves than what God has commanded. Let's just do what God has said. Let's just follow the teachings and principles that the Bible reveals to us, no more, no less. And when Satan comes knocking to try to get us to compromise what God has said and what Jesus has said and what the Bible has instructed us in, let's push him away. As Moses rebuffed all of these compromising methods that Pharaoh brought, can we just push it away and stay steadfast to what God has commanded? How can we help you do that today? Maybe there's something we could study further with you, but if you're committed this morning, something we could pray for you concerning, or even if it's time to step into the remission of sins that comes through the blood of the Lamb. As Paul taught in Romans 6, in the first 6 verses of that text, as we studied a portion of it today, that we come in contact through baptism with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. How can we help you? Strengthen you in your resolve to serve the Lord without compromise. And if there's something we can encourage you in even this morning, won't you come as we stand and as we sing?